Crysis was truly one of the last of its kind, as the 6th and 7th console generations brought about the era of first-person shooters being just as, if not more popular on console than PC. Developers were quick to switch their developmental focus. Some became platform agnostic, modifying each version of their game to work best for its respective platform. Others chased the much more lucrative console market first, leading to an era of lackluster, subpar PC ports that still hasn't entirely ended. Regardless of the path chosen, both of these groups were, and often still are, restricted by the capabilities of the lowest common denominator. It doesn't matter if every PC player has a monster rig, the game still has to run on the oldest, slowest consoles on the market. 10 years after the release of the Xbox 360, the aging console was still holding back games like Watch Dogs, Call of Duty, and Battlefield. We're currently experiencing the very same thing with the original Xbox One and PlayStation 4. I'm not a PC elitist, far from it, but it's impossible to deny that innovation is somewhat limited by the slow pace of which new consoles are released. But as far as traditional first-person shooter video games go, Crysis was an exception to the rule. This was the last time we saw developers say, to hell with the console market, and really see how far they could push PC hardware. But in truth, if there was anyone you'd have expected to make this sort of thing, it was Crytek. The German software developer got their start developing PC benchmark software, not games. But that software caught the attention of Nvidia, leading to a partnership that earned Crytek enough money to fund and develop their own engine, and with it their own game. After splitting with Ubisoft and partnering with Electronic Arts, the company shifted their focus towards a new version of CryEngine, which launched in 2007 alongside the engine's new flagship game, Crysis. What followed was one of the most memorable reactions to a gaming event in recent memory. Crysis is a touchstone of PC gaming culture, even to this day, long after it ceased being the most impressive technical showcase available to the public. But can it run Crysis is mostly a meme today, but 10 years ago it was a valid question. At time of release, not even the best PC parts on the market could coax a stable frame rate out of the game's higher settings. I vividly remember stumbling my way through the first half of the game on my Asus laptop back then, its mobile GPU sporting a whopping 512 megs of VRAM and serving as a humbling reminder of how far gaming laptops have come. But even today, my modern gaming rigs struggle to break the triple-digit frame rate mark, something that's far more important in the age of high refresh rate 2K displays being the norm rather than science fiction. Crucially though, it's not just graphical fidelity that earned Crysis its reputation. The game's physics and mechanics are just as impressive as its visuals. Dense foliage reacts to the player and their movements, buildings crumble bit by bit during firefights, bullets pierce barrels of oil which subsequently drain into the ocean, clouding the water as they do so. Crysis may not have aged like fine wine, but it does things that are enough to impress me almost 15 years later. Things that the newest blockbusters often don't even attempt. And while the game may not be open world, its levels rival later Battlefield maps in scale. All of this is still true on 360 and PS3. The sprawling island of Crysis is just as interactive and alive as it was on the PC. Crysis, at least the first half of it anyway, was an open-ended experience. Those massive maps allowed for all manner of playstyles, tactics, and creative solutions. Do you stealth past enemies without firing a single bullet, or do you drive through the front gate, 50 caliber turret blazing? You could pick off enemies from afar, or you could creep up and crush their trachea in the iron grip of the nanosuit. And of course, there's the tried and true method of yeeting live chickens into the Koreans' faces. I don't know that Crysis is quite enough going on to be called systemic, but the skeleton of what Far Cry would grow into under Ubisoft is on display here in strikingly recognizable form. The degree of freedom Crytek gives the player to decide how they wish to approach any given scenario, and their respective consequences of failure, aren't a far cry from Far Cry 3. If you've never played the Crysis games, this all probably sounds incredible. If you have, then I suspect you're waiting to hear the word that must be said every time the original Crysis is discussed. But Crysis 1 may be one of the most important games in PC gaming history, but there is a reason that nobody ever asks, can it run Crysis 2? The Crysis franchise is published by Electronic Arts, which makes it all the more remarkable that Crysis was greenlit as a PC exclusive that a fraction of computers on the market could even run, let alone run smoothly. EA being EA, I'm surprised something like this happened in the first place, but lightning rarely strikes twice. When Crysis 2 was announced at E3 2009, it was almost unrecognizable as a Crysis game, save for the nanosuit on the cover. It was still a futuristic power fantasy, but sprawling tropical islands were nowhere to be found, having been replaced with the claustrophobic asphalt and glass corridors of New York City. It was clear that story would play a much larger role in Crysis 2 than the original, and levels were now closer in size and length to the likes of Call of Duty. That might sound like a bizarre change of direction, and that's because it was. The nanosuit's abilities were scaled back, dozens of possible solutions to each encounter were trimmed down to 2 or 3. But the most surprising bit is that 4 years after Crysis, a game whose identity was shaped by existing on the cutting edge of graphics and tech, the sequel would release day and date on a pair of aging consoles that were deemed too weak to run the original game at all. I should put forth a disclaimer now that I don't dislike Crysis 2. It's actually my favorite of the Cryses. But Jesus, EA did everything it could to alienate the PC audience that gave Crysis the chance to even become a franchise in the first place. At the same time, Crysis 2 was unlikely to win favor with an already crowded FPS market. It was a sequel to a game that console players literally could not play, and despite all reductions in scale, the game didn't run particularly well on the 360 or PS3. EA likely figured that the latter was par for the course. The systems were going on 6 years old at this point, being largely considered overdue for replacement. Just a few months after Crysis 2's release, Crytek were finally able to bring the first game to the console market. Now, this wasn't a simple case of mapping controls to a gamepad, putting the graphics on low, and shipping the game. CryEngine 2 may have been cutting edge in 2007, but it lacked the optimization and support for low-end hardware offered by CryEngine 3. By porting the entirety of Crysis 1 into the new engine, the team were able to achieve somewhat acceptable performance on consoles. I say somewhat because while it was technically playable, Crysis for Xbox 360 didn't exactly run smoothly. It's impressive that it ran at all, don't get me wrong, but frame rate dips into the low teens don't exactly make for the best action game experience. But almost a decade later, Crysis is available on new Xboxes as a backwards compatible title, and on the Xbox One X, it runs at an almost completely stable 30 frames per second, only dropping in the final 2 levels of the game. This isn't a result of any specific Xbox One X enhancements. According to Digital Foundry, the target frame rate is and always has been 31 frames per second, and playing on any newer Xbox should yield higher frame rates than the original console. Until Crysis Remastered launched earlier this year, the 360 version on One X was the best way to experience the game on consoles. Given that the 360 version is now included in Game Pass, it's probably not even worth buying the remastered version. After all, the remasters are based on the 360 and PS3 port, meaning that all the improvements persist in the newest version of the game. Unfortunately, so does the missing content and porting issues. While the Xbox 360 wasn't capable of matching the raw fidelity of the PC version, CryEngine 3 did allow a number of visual tweaks that added a dash of stylization to the game. The fanbase is still a bit split on whether these changes are welcome improvements or bloom-rooted downgrades. Crysis's fidelity is just that, fidelity. It doesn't have a defining art style as much as it relies on realism, but on console, that would not fly. I'm personally a fan of the game's new look, but unfortunately the other concessions made in order to get this game working on the old systems, and their controllers, aren't as subjective in nature. Probably the most discussed of these changes is the complete omission of an entire level. It's a bit up in the air whether this omission was due to technical limitations or just the community's negative reaction to its inclusion in the first place. But either way, I don't like the idea of re-releases and remasters cutting out a chunk of the game's original content, even if it wasn't great to play. So while Crytek definitely doesn't get a pass for the 2020 remasters, I do suspect the level's exclusion from the 2011 port was born of necessity, not revisionism. The 360 can barely handle Crysis's final boss. I can't even imagine squeezing a level that doesn't have draw distance onto a console that was already underpowered in 2005. Most other frustration I experienced during my playthrough was not a direct result of the port, but instead a consequence of Crytek's less than stellar game design. But before I open that can of worms, there is one more part of the port that needs to be addressed. Crytek clearly understood that some of the game's original shortcomings weren't going to fly on a controller. Crysis for console sees the mechanics tweaked for the platform. On PC, Crysis frequently left me scratching my head and wondering how a perfectly zeroed sniper shot missed, but on console, I have no trouble doming targets from 200 meters away. Given Crysis 2's gamepad-focused development, it wouldn't surprise me if the hitboxes in CryEngine 3 are more generous than its predecessors, and I'd be curious to see if this improvement carries over to the PC version of the 2020 remaster. A less positive impact of Crysis 2's then recent release can be seen in the simplified suit controls. PC version of Crysis allowed the player to freely toggle between strength, speed, armor, and cloak modes. But the sequel saw strength and speed being demoted from their own suit modes to simple actions that consume suit energy, a change that carries over to Crysis for consoles. Strength jump and melee are activated simply by holding the normal buttons for longer, and speed mode is gone entirely, simply replaced with a sprint button. This leaves armor and cloak, and as in Crysis 2, these are single button presses to activate. There are a number of upsides to these changes. Popping in and out of stealth to take someone down is now much more intuitive, and armor mode is now only a button press away instead of having to hold, drag, and release in the middle of a firefight. But it's clear that Crytek were simply running out of buttons on the controller, because removing the ability to enter speed mode without sprinting fundamentally changes the game's movement and energy management mechanics that made the PC version feel so dynamic. Speed mode used to let you crawl, crouch, walk, and swim faster, all without draining energy. And when in other armor modes, you could sprint at a slower pace for free too. But on console, you have two movement speeds. Sunday Stroll, and sprinting full blast with all the energy drain that entails. Sprinting during a battle means not having maximum armor when you need it, and the default walk speed means that running and gunning is now completely infeasible, doubly so because grenades and other explosives now require multiple button inputs to use. The slower movement speed even breaks scripted sequences, where you're supposed to be following an NPC doing that non-speed mode jog this version removes. Clearly, Crytek's plan was to reinterpret Crysis to imitate Crysis 2's controls and mechanics. The game's design doesn't facilitate that. Crysis 2 was designed from the ground up to still provide numerous tactical options despite the streamlining, but Crysis 1 blatantly wasn't, and it shows. All simplifying the suit controls did was make the few strategies that still work more frustrating to pull off, and I can't even imagine how this game must play on Delta difficulty. Now, it should be noted that it is possible to modify games for console audiences without cutting the sandbox in half. Freeze time, as well as ability and weapon wheels, became popular in console games for a reason. Crytek's interpretation of Crysis for consoles resembles Call of Duty in control scheme, but without any of the scripting and structure that allows that game to work the way it does. To Crytek's credit, though, the second half of the game does control better, but that's a backhanded compliment. Playing Crysis for this video was my first time playing it to completion. I've had the game since around 2009, but never played past the halfway point. So in other words, I finished the game years ago. Jokes aside, Crysis can be bisected down the middle into what are essentially two entirely different experiences. The first half plays a lot like Metal Gear Solid 5, albeit a much less polished version. You play as Nomad, and you're dropped into a series of massive levels containing a spattering of North Korean military bases, checkpoints, and patrols. You're given primary and secondary objectives, but as previously discussed, how you accomplish them is up to you. But halfway through, things change dramatically in almost every way. After killing the North Korean general, the entire war is forgotten entirely. North Korea has developed their own nanosuits, and... Wait, you wanted a conclusion to that plot thread? It's never mentioned again in any of the three games. How the hell did Prophet survive being skewered by the squiddy things from the Matrix? He's hard to kill, I guess? That's all the explanation you're given. The second half of the game plays much more like Halo than the first half of Crysis. Stealth and alternative solutions are technically possible, but the player is, let's say, strongly encouraged to gun their way through the remainder. But while Halo is designed around that sandbox, Crysis once again isn't. It's in this section that the lack of speed mode becomes even more frustrating. Stealth is basically useless and almost every enemy flies, so strength mode might as well not exist. Crysis is the video game equivalent of the "now draw the other eye" meme. Listen, I understand that Crytek were a relatively small studio when they made the original Crysis, and I also understand that they were software developers first that stumbled their way into game design. But did nobody during development think, half of the designing we did has zero impact on the second half of our game? The final boss is where this all comes to a point. The exoskeleton and mothership fights are infamously terrible even on PC, but between that, the unstable frame rate, and attempting to wrangle my entire arsenal of weapons and abilities with this, I can genuinely no longer tell what's a bug and what's just poor design. I spent almost an hour trying to beat the exoskeleton, gave up, went to sleep, woke up the next morning and immediately beat it first try, and I have two theories as to why this was. Either this bastard is immune to Gauss cannon and missile launcher rounds, something that this game does not signpost in the slightest, or my game was bugged and I wasn't actually doing damage. Between that and the thing's propensity to pick me up and yeet me across the carrier in the middle trying to grab more supplies, this boss fight was just frustrating. You're even instructed to stay close to the monster, so Rosenthal can hack its shields with your suit. But given that I was able to beat it by spamming minigun rounds from afar, I'm not convinced the game was telling me the truth. And the mothership fight that comes immediately after is so underwhelming in comparison that it should have just been cut. From the almost comically buggy animations of being frozen, to the way Nomad's head clips through the tentacles when the exoskeleton throws him, it's pretty clear that this boss fight wasn't even finished when Crysis shipped. The fact that neither the console release nor the remaster took any steps to fix any of these issues is heinous. Instead, what we got was a half-assed port job that took the shortest, easiest route to making the game work on consoles, even if that meant breaking its balance and removing an entire level. The larger hitboxes are the only inarguable improvement to Crysis' sandbox, and I'm still not convinced they weren't an accidental consequence of porting the game to CryEngine 3. Likewise, the console version's new look was simply masking the fact that the game had to be turned down to lower than low settings to even run. But, and there's always a but when I make this sort of video, Crysis for the Xbox 360 is still a net positive experience, aside from the fact that I just find ports like this genuinely fascinating. There is a reason that it took me until 2020 to finish this game. As I get older and spend more time at my desk than ever before, it's become increasingly difficult to separate work from play. Doubly so because my work involves play. Spending an additional 10 hours at my desk when I'm supposed to be unwinding is a tough ask, especially when older games require tweaks and fixes to get the optimal experience. Consoles might not reach the same heights, but man, if it's not relieving for something to just work at the end of a long day. I had no intention of making a video about Crysis anytime soon. I literally just saw that the 360 version was in Game Pass and decided to try it out, especially as I'd already been fiending to replay Crysis 2. Jumping into these games was literally as simple as downloading them and pressing a button. Playing them on PC involved swapping the executable with a 64-bit fan fix, deciphering why my digital copy of the game wanted a CD to be inserted, figuring out why the game was locked 24 frames per second, and in the case of Crysis 2, the game just straight up crashes to desktop at seemingly random intervals. The console versions of these games may not be the smoothest or best looking ways to play, but damn if they don't just work every time without issue. The multiplayer even still works provided you can find people to play with. As a preservationist, it's important not to discount the value of console ports like Crysis for the Xbox 360. It's not quite as good as the PC version, no, and the PC version wasn't even all that great to begin with. But one of the best things about backwards compatibility is that it ensures that generations of games will remain playable without tracking down old hardware or forcing the average player to spend valuable time fixing old broken games. And maybe it's because I'm a racing game fan first, but that's amazing to me. I've finished Crysis, I finally know how it ends, and I guarantee you that if I had to spend an hour at my desk fixing the PC version just for half of my shots to whiff because of the old engine's hitboxes, I wouldn't have made it that far. Crysis for Xbox 360 is a flawed port of a flawed game, but I'm glad I played it, and I'm extremely excited to revisit the sequel having experienced the game that started it all. So, can consoles run Crysis? Yes they can. And one can only hope that modern audiences discovering these games on their shiny new consoles means that one day we'll get to step into the nanosuit once again.